Welcome to the lecture on gene culture coevolution. Hopefully we understand what genes are, we understand what culture is, and we're going to be discussing how the two inheritance systems can co-evolve. So, just a reminder, culture is socially learned information, information that you acquire from other individuals, and this includes most of human behavior. In humans, it's long-lived and cumulative, much more so compared to any other species. And the benefit of culture is that you can learn some information from another individual, improve upon it yourself, and then pass that cumulative complex on to somebody else. And in this way, culture is mostly very, very adaptive, although we did discuss some ways of how culture can be maladaptive in the previous presentation. Culture is an ontogenetic explanation for behavior, and as we said, most of human behavior can be explained. Differences in human behavior can be explained culturally. However, explaining our ability to have culture requires an ultimate explanation, and we understand culture as an evolved suite of abilities, including some psychological learning mechanisms that require cooperation, because after all, culture is shared information, so it requires cooperation. Let's talk about coevolution. Coevolution is the change in a biological product in response to another biological product. So a characteristic in a species that is genetically inherited comes under some selection pressure due to a characteristic that's genetically inherited in another species. So we see this between human immune systems and bacteria and viruses. As our differential survival affects future generations' ability to react to viruses and bacteria, and in turn changes in the viruses and bacteria to better take advantage of our immune systems. So we have two systems of inheritance: our genetic defense system against viruses and bacteria, and the ability of viruses and bacteria to infect us. These two are co-evolving, so one system is constantly responding to the other, and in a way it's very much like an arms race. Predators and prey also experience this. This is a particular type of lizard that has very extreme levels of toxin. They're predated upon by garter snakes, and as garter snakes improve their ability to handle the venom, the lizard has to up its production of such, and so there's a response between the two genetic inheritance systems. So if we were to sum this up, it's systems of inheritance responding to each other's selective pressures. And I think I hear a little voice inside your head saying, well, culture is a system of inheritance. We socially learn information and pass it on. And since genetic change has resulted in cultural abilities, can this go the other way? We have two systems of inheritance. We have culture and genes. Can they respond to changes in one another? Can culture, and the big issue here is, can culture create an environmental pressure long enough to exert selective pressure on genes? Because culture can change very, very quickly. But if it does remain stable, and if our learned behavior changes the environment enough for long enough, it might create new environmental selection pressures on genes. So that's what we're talking about here when we talk about gene culture coevolution. One very well studied example of gene culture coevolution is the evolution of lactose tolerance. This is the ability to digest milk as adults, and only a few populations around the world have this ability. Most populations, adults are unable to digest milk sugars as adults. They're lactose tolerant. So here's how the argument goes. Okay, we start off with humans. We see some genetic change, which allows for culture to happen. In one particular case, our cultural abilities allow us to become dairy farmers. So learned information allows us to be able to start domesticating cattle or sheep or goats or camels, and being able to drink their milk as adults. However, in ancestral environments, because most adults wouldn't need to digest milk, you wouldn't need to do that after you finish your dependence on mom's lactation. So perhaps because dairy farming is a very stable livelihood for a lot of people, if there is a genetic change that allows some adults in these populations to digest milk sugars as an adult, we might see a selective pressure on genes to allow the absorption of lactose. And this is exactly what we see around the world. Cultures with a history of dairying, a long, stable history of dairying, in these populations we've actually seen genetic mutations that prevents the lactose tolerance switch being turned off after weaning. And we see, in fact, 4 distinct genetic mutations that allow this to occur. So because culture was stable enough, it was beneficial for individuals in these dairy farming cultures to drink milk as adults. We saw selective pressure on the genes. So gene culture coevolution requires culture to change much more slowly than genes. And this is in fact fairly rare. Most cultural information changes very quickly, or at least more quickly compared to genes. However, we can use gene culture coevolution, this theory, to solve one big problem about cooperation that we haven't gotten around to talking about yet. And that is explaining cooperation on large scales. So a lot of human cooperation occurs in groups that are much larger than can be supported by relatedness or reciprocity. So a lot of human cooperation occurs in contexts where you're cooperating with unrelated individuals who might not be cooperating back with you. And this is a mystery of how we can gain such large cooperative groups, or cooperative groups with non-relatives, or in anonymous situations when you might not be benefiting. So how can we produce this suite of behaviors if you're not making up on the cost that you're paying to help other individuals? And it might be due to this coevolution between culture and cooperation. So if we think about capacities for cooperation as a result of natural selection on multiple levels, then perhaps we can explain large-scale cooperation. So one of the really cool advances in theoretical biology lately was realizing that it's not just individuals competing for success in populations. There's actually cooperation among genes, there's cooperation among sperm and eggs, and there's cooperation among cultural groups and competition among cultural groups. So how might a group selection argument look? And I know you've done some reading, so review the readings in Meeting at Grand Central. If you're having trouble understanding this presentation, you can flip back and forth between the two. Okay, so what do we need to see a natural selection of groups? This would be a group selection. Well, when we talk about natural selection, we've talked about 3 key traits. We need to see variation between individuals. So in this case, is there variation between groups? Do groups even exist? Is the variation heritable? Is this variation passed down between generations? And are the groups in competition? And do heritable characteristics affect their competitiveness? Biologically, we know group selection is very, very difficult, and mostly this is because there is so little or no variation between groups that group selection is not possible because there's nothing to select between. When individuals migrate between groups, they take their genes with them, and essentially there's no genetic variation between groups of most species. When we do see biological group selection, it's limited almost entirely to the social insects because they have special mechanisms of genetic inheritance that makes groups more related to their own members and less related to other members. So biologically, we talked about this already, people or individuals, organisms, it's very unlikely that they do things for the good of the group outside of their very close kin. Cultural group selection makes this possible among humans because we can see variation between groups. This variation is passed down as individuals socially learn, group variation, and cultural groups can be in competition. And I'm going to walk through the points of evidence here. So groups do exist culturally. It's pretty obvious at first blush, and almost all the variation between human groups is cultural. So this is a graph of some research done on how much groups vary, and there's two types of variation here. There's biological variation, which is almost zero. So this is looking at several different genes and how much they vary from group to group. There's very, very little, almost zero biological variation between human groups. Cultural variation is much higher, in some cases quite high. So the only variation that we do see between groups is cultural. So we have culturally varying groups. This variation is heritable, so the cultural markers that are passed down between groups allows these groups to stay separated even with migration and mixing, and cultural transmission can really preserve this variation. So signals about group membership, like flags and ethnic markers. This is my brother-in-law wearing his spaghetti monster hat very proudly. Cultural transmission allows the variation between groups to be preserved between generations. So, do groups compete? Is there differential survival and reproductive success of human groups? And the short answer to that is yes. From reading the Yanomamo, you know that there's a lot of competition between groups in this case. And how well those groups do in competition affects their own likelihood of survival and their likelihood of increasing in numbers. So here's some examples of other small-scale warfare, both historical reproductions and continuing small-scale warfare today. So I just wanted to go through one quick example. This is an example of the Nuer and the Dinka, who, I'll flip ahead and come back, who are living in Central Eastern Africa, in Ethiopia, roughly. They're very similar in terms of habitat and technology and ecology. They're both pastoralist groups. But there are some striking cultural differences between the two. And what these cultural differences have resulted in is by the time that the British came into this area, the Nuer were rapidly expanding into the Dinka territories, and pretty much every time they came in contact with the Dinka, the Nuer would win. How could this be? Well, the Nuer had, and you don't have to remember all this, it's just some information for you. The Nuer were able to have larger war parties, and part of this was due to bride wealth and the way that their political organization worked. And everywhere they expanded into the Dinka territory, the Dinka were assimilated into the Nuer group. So it's not that cultural groups have to directly kill members of other cultural groups, as long as your cultural group is increasing by either killing other members or converting them to your own group norms. This is still cultural group success. And if you've ever taken a class involving the word globalization, you know what I mean. Now the trick is here, multi-level selection doesn't mean that culture is always winning out, or cultural groups are always winning out over individuals. It depends on what's at stake, and it depends on what will increase an individual's fitness more. Will defecting on your group member bring you a large pot of money, or will cooperating with group members allow you to beat out other groups? And this varies from situation to situation. But what it means when there are high rewards to competing as groups, when there's benefits to group competition, these can place selective pressures on behaviors that benefit the good of the group. And so gene culture coevolution is one explanation of why we can get large-scale group cooperation the way we do, like Hands Across America, for example, where cultural groups exist and create a selection for genetic predispositions to cooperate with group members. Groups with members who cooperate better are more likely to win against other groups. And so there might be some sort of cultural pressure to select for genetic predispositions that make groups more competitive. So here's a summary. If culture is stable enough, it can create selection pressures on genes. So this is gene culture coevolution, and the example we looked at was lactose tolerance. Group selection is very hard biologically, and it's quite rare, but it's easier with culture because cultural groups exist, the variation between the groups is heritable, and cultural groups are often in competition with one another. Individuals can potentially benefit from taking advantage of group members or by working with them. When individuals benefit from working with group members to compete with other groups, this can select for pro-social behaviors. That's it on gene culture coevolution. I know this is a very hard topic to understand. I recommend you getting in touch with me if you have questions or you feel like you don't understand this, or reviewing the chapter in Meeting at Grand Central Station. This is probably the most complex argument that we'll be making in this class. But I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and thanks for listening.